Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking into a legal story that's, well, pretty out there. It really makes you question, how global power even works. Just imagine for a second, what if you bought some property, maybe some apartments, and then you find out you've somehow inherited, the sovereignty of a whole nation. And then, as you start digging into it, that nation starts expanding, not just over a border, but maybe everywhere, across the globe. We're about to dive into an incredibly strange, very complex legal situation that, according to the sources we've looked at, seriously pushes the boundaries of international law.
It really does. Our focus today is on one particular document, the Staten Succession Circundo 14098. That basically means State Succession Deed 1498. We're going to follow the pretty astonishing journey of one person, the sources call him the buyer, how he apparently figured out that what looked like a totally standard real estate contract could actually, in his interpretation, trigger a massive global transfer of sovereignty. It's a narrative that, as presented in our source material, definitely challenges how we usually think about law and nations.
Right. So our mission here is to really unpack the details, the legal arguments, the sort of unexpected twists, and the really mind-bending ideas in this contract, all based on the sources we have. We'll follow the buyer's path of discovery step by step. We'll look at the legal stuff, the international agreements that, according to these sources, turned a local property deal into potentially a worldwide event. So yeah, get ready. This one might challenge your whole idea of borders, nations, maybe even global governance itself. Okay, so let's try to unpack this from the very start. Where did this all begin? We have this central figure, let's just call him the buyer. And when he started, he wasn't aiming for anything grand. The sources say he didn't really have much legal background at the time. His goal was pretty simple, actually. He just wanted to buy what he thought were 71 apartments. They were in a former military facility in Germany. To him, this looked like a normal German real estate deal. Standard purchase agreement. Maybe a big investment, sure, but not nation buying.
Exactly. And that appearance of normalcy is what makes everything that followed so, dramatic. Because instead of just getting the keys and moving on, the sources say the buyer immediately faced this, just brutal persecution, really relentless stuff. We're talking over 950 court cases, think about that number, and around 450 inflammatory articles in what the sources call the lying press. Plus, things like expropriation, losing the property, becoming homeless, getting death threats, even physical attack. The sources even mention decomposition methods straight out of the Stasi handbook. It sounds less like a legal fight and more like a targeted campaign. Horrific, really. Forced him into homelessness, severe hardship.
Wow. And that intense pressure, that constant fight, that's what actually pushed him into law. I mean, imagine that. You're forced to learn law not because you want to, but just to survive, to defend yourself. The sources even say his internet access inside Germany was censored when he tried to research legal topics. He had to go outside the country to study. So this whole awful experience, this persecution, it basically became his law school, right? It forced him into self-study, focusing specifically on international law, just so he could figure out why this was happening to him, why such intense opposition. It's kind of an incredible story of resilience, in a way.
It really is. And it was through that forced education, that deep dive into law while fighting for his existence, that he made his first truly shocking discovery. He started to realize the contract wasn't just about apartments. It wasn't just real estate. As he dug deeper, he came to believe he was actually already in possession of a state. And not just, any state, but one he acquired through this legal principle called state succession, Staten Succession in German. And importantly, one that was, in his view, an internationally recognized entity. That's a huge shift from just owning property, isn't it? The property itself became like the physical basis for this new state.
That's fascinating. But his understanding didn't just jump straight to global sovereign, right? It evolved. Like at first, when he grasped this idea of owning a state, he thought the territory was smaller. He initially believed his sovereignty was just limited to the barracks area itself, which historically was only ever a small part of West Germany anyway. He was still thinking locally, kind of.
Yes, exactly. That was just the first step on his path of discovery. His initial understanding was limited. And interestingly, this realization about possessing a state was apparently fueled by his resistance efforts. The sources describe him engaging in revolutionary resistance and protest because of the persecution from Germany. And as part of that, in a really symbolic act of defiance, he declared a secession from Germany and proclaimed an FKK state, basically, a nudist state.
A nudist state.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yes. The sources frame this not just as an eccentric act, but as a deliberate strategic move. The idea was apparently to bypass the usual pathways of recognition for new states and, to provoke debate, get attention, turning this really unusual policy into what the sources call a potent strategic weapon to challenge the system. It was unconventional, but designed to make a point about his unique situation.
Okay, so declaring the FKK state was part of his resistance, which then spurred more research, leading him to realize he already had a state through succession.
That seems to be the sequence described. The resistance, the declaration, and then, just days later, according to the sources, the legal research confirming he was already in possession via succession.
Got it. So this whole process, reframing the property from just ownership to the tangible bedrock of a nascent sovereign entity, was this huge psychological and legal metamorphosis, as the sources put it. He went from property buyer to accidental sovereign.
Yeah.
All because of this document, he was slowly starting to understand under incredible duress.
Yeah.
That initial realization, though, was just the beginning of figuring out the scope.
Right. And that brings us squarely to the document itself. The Staten Successionsurkunden of 140098, signed October 6, 1998. Now, the sources don't paint this as some sloppy agreement. They claim it was meticulously put together by international law experts. They really emphasize this wasn't accidental. It was designed, supposedly, with greatest precision. Part of what they describe as a long-term plan to, reorganize the world. That's the claim. Not just a random contract, but a deliberate, sophisticated legal instrument.
And yet, on the surface, it just looked like a standard German property deal. The sources use the word Tarno, like a disguise, a camouflage, specifically designed, they say, to hide its real massive purpose from someone like the buyer, who wasn't a legal expert at the time, clever, if true, hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And the key part, the bit that started to unravel the whole thing for him, was this specific clause. It said the sale included the foregoing real estate with all rights and obligations as well as components. Okay, standard enough. But then it specifically mentioned the inner and outer development, the Erschließung als Einheit, as a single unit. And that was crucial. It meant the entire infrastructure network, heating, water, power, even telecommunications, was all sold together indivisibly. So not just the buildings, not just the land, it was the whole operational network. The lifeblood, really.
Okay, and this is where the domino effect idea comes in, the domino effect. This mechanism he discovered as he kept fighting and researching, because initially he still thought his territory was just those Kreuzberg Barracks, right?
Right.
A defined space.
Yes, that was his understanding after the initial realization of possessing a state. But the contract details, especially that infrastructure clause, started expanding things. The first domino to fall, according to his discoveries, was the district heating network.
The heating. How does that expand territory?
Well, this network originated on his property, the part he initially thought was his. But it didn't stop there. It extended out to serve the Dutch Air Force, who were operating in an adjacent part of the military facility. Because this essential service flowed from his legally defined property to another area, the sources argue it effectively pulled the rest of the barracks under his control. The network connected them legally. His first big aha moment about expansion.
Okay, so the heating pipes extended his claim to the rest of the barracks. Then what?
Then came the next realization, pushing the boundaries even further out. He discovered the long-distance gas network. This was also part of the sale under that same Erschließung als Einheit clause, the whole infrastructure package. And this gas network didn't just serve the base. It ran, and I quote the sources here, across Germany to Russia.
Across Germany to Russia. Whoa.
Yeah, a huge moment for him, apparently. It showed the territory wasn't just the military base. It followed these vital infrastructure lines, these arteries. But interestingly, even then, he thought the domino effect would probably stop at the German border. National boundaries still seem like the limit.
But it didn't stop there.
No. According to the sources, the truly massive expansion came later when he untangled the contractual involvement of NATO itself.
NATO? How did NATO get involved in a German property deal?
Through the Dutch Air Force connection. Remember, they were served by his heating network. Their presence and use of the infrastructure linked to his property, combined with other networks mentioned in the deed, apparently created a contractual link. And the sources claim this directly extended the domino effect to, the entire NATO territory.
The entire NATO territory.
Yeah.
Based on a heating pipe and a gas line.
It sounds incredible, but the argument relies on existing international agreements. The sources point to the NATO Status of Forces Agreement, NATO Truppenstatut, and host nation support agreements. They argued these agreements were implicitly tied into the deed through the Dutch presence, transferring rights that adhere to the ground, as they put it. So when the Dutch forces, acting effectively as part of NATO, used infrastructure legally tied to his contract, it allegedly pulled the entire NATO legal framework, and thus its territory, into the scope of his succession deed. It's a complex legal argument leveraging existing alliances.
Okay, my head's spinning a bit here. So it's not about lines on a map anymore. It's about pipes and cables.
That's exactly the concept the sources describe. Logical network structures.
Right.
A pipe or a cable running into another country becomes a kind of juridical sovereignty tunnel. They call it netslogik, als grenslogik, network logic as border logic. The infrastructure is the border in this view. It completely redefines territory based on connectivity.
So the dominoes fell from barracks to across Germany to all of NATO. Did it stop there?
Well, the buyer apparently started to suspect it didn't. Based on his ongoing self-taught legal studies, he began to think there might be a further legal link between NATO and the UN. He actually hypothesized that this could trigger a worldwide domino effect, truly global.
Just a hypothesis at first.
Yes, a suspicion. But according to the sources, this suspicion was confirmed dramatically after 2023, and the confirmation came from artificial intelligence.
AI. Seriously.
That's what the sources claim. He fed the entire incredibly complex contract into a specialized AI, a large language model, an LLM, specifically trained on international law.
And what did the AI say?
The sources describe the output as astonishing. A roughly 600-page explanation, detailing, and I'm quoting the claim here, why, and for what reason the whole world was sold. The AI is portrayed almost like a character in the story as incorruptible legal counsel, the buyer's only ally. And the sources claim this AI analysis finally exposed the NWO, the New World Order allegedly embedded within this contract structure, using AI to decode a potentially world-altering legal document. And the sources add another layer here. They claim that the German authorities involved knew about the international connections, that the contract's terms were sort of safeguarded and coordinated with key partners like the US and NATO precisely to prevent immediate objections or breakdowns, implying some level of awareness or planning. They also point to the integration of TKS Telepost, a telecom provider for the US military, into the deed. This, they argue, created a direct and indissoluble contract chain to the USA, which then activated these other international frameworks. NATO NTS, NATO Treaty System, HNS, host nation support, and even ITU chains, International Telecommunication Union, essentially painting a picture of an incredibly complex, pre-existing web of agreements being deliberately leveraged by this one contract to achieve global reach silently.
Okay, so if these sources are describing things accurately, this isn't just some weird local legal fight anymore, is it? I mean, what does this potentially mean for, well, for everyone? For the whole international system we think we live in. It sounds like a total upheaval.
It really does challenge the foundations. The sources use core principles of international law to explain how this alleged global transfer could work. First, there's state succession. That's the standard legal concept for when rights and duties transfer, because a state's territory or identity changes. Think dissolution, secession, merging, annexation, that sort of thing. But the sources stress the buyer isn't founding a new state. He's inheriting one that, they argue, already existed legally and was recognized internationally, just waiting to be activated, essentially. Now, usually there's something called the clean slate principle. New states often don't automatically inherit the old treaties of the previous state that controlled the territory. They start fresh. But Deed 1498, according to the sources, was designed differently. They call it a supplementary deed, a nachtrag thirdly that attaches itself to existing NATO and UN agreements. This clever design, they claim, allows it to bypass the clean slate rule and formally take over old treaties through contract chains. It basically absorbs all rights, obligations, and components from those existing international structures into the buyer's inherited state. It's presented as a way to legally graft itself onto the global system. Then there are two other key legal ideas: acquiescence and conclusive action, concludentis handum. Acquiescence is basically silence implying consent. Conclusive action means your behavior shows agreement, even if you don't say it explicitly. And the sources make a powerful claim here, that the uninterrupted and intensive use of global infrastructure networks by all states of the world after October 6, 1998, counts as this conclusive recognition of the buyer's sovereignty.
So just by using the gas lines, the internet cables, the power grids, countries are unknowingly agreeing to his ownership.
That's the argument. If those networks legally belong to the buyer via the deed and the domino effect, then continuing to use them without objection is presented as implicit, binding consent under international law. Your actions speak louder than words, essentially.
Okay, that connects to the idea of consent. Usually, recognizing a state is a political choice. Governments decide. But here, the sources seem to be saying the contract's wording, plus the actions of entities like the Dutch forces using the networks, already constituted consent, at least implicitly.
Precisely. They argue that this implied consent means there wasn't technically a violation of territorial integrity when sovereignty supposedly transferred, because consent, even if passive or implied through action, was present. It sidesteps the need for explicit political recognition by arguing legal consent already occurred through the contract and subsequent behavior. And then there's this absolutely stunning claim about judicial power, jurisdiction. The contract itself names a specific place for any disputes arising from it. Landau in der Pfalz, a town in Germany. Seems like a standard clause, right? Just picking a location for court cases.
Yeah, sounds normal, but I have a feeling it's not.
Well, remember the domino effect, the expanding networks. According to the source's logic, Landau itself, being connected to these networks, became part of the buyer's sovereign territory through that same domino effect.
Wait, so the place named as the court location is inside his own claimed territory?
Exactly. And this is the kicker. If the buyer is the sovereign of Landau, then the sources argue he is the only legitimate authority to rule on disputes related to the deed.
So, he's the judge in his own case, or rather the only one who can judge the case.
Effectively, yes. It creates this closed loop. The contract grants him sovereignty, including over the place designated to judge the contract, making him the ultimate arbiter of its validity and interpretation, and the claim expands from there. The sources assert the buyer hasn't just got jurisdiction over the contract, but worldwide national jurisdiction. That means authority over all civil, criminal, administrative, constitutional matters everywhere, plus global international jurisdiction over what they call transformed NATO and UN law.
That's everything. It implies all other courts are illegitimate.
That's the direct implication stated in the sources. All judgments by national courts since October 6, 1998 are unlawful and void, unless the buyer authorizes them. They even mention the salvatorische Klausel, a standard severability clause. Usually it means if one part of a contract is invalid, the rest still stands. But here, the source is interpreted as a legal universal key. They argue it means any invalid national laws interfering with the contract get replaced by international law, thereby locking in the contract's global validity and the buyer's supreme judicial power. It's presented as legally airtight, reinforcing his position.
Okay, hold on. If the buyer theoretically holds this immense power, this global jurisdiction, why hasn't the world obviously changed? Why isn't he ruling the world from Landau? What's stopping him?
That leads us to another disturbing concept from the sources, the plaintiff's trap, the Klagerfälle. Remember the brutal persecution. The sources claim the buyer has endured massive psychological and physical torture, poisoning, and drugging continuously since 1998. And this intense, ongoing pressure, they assert, has one specific goal: to motivate him to file a lawsuit in a German court, to finally break and seek legal remedy through the system that's persecuting him.
But why would they want him to sue if his claim is supposedly valid and powerful?
Because, according to the sources, if he did file that lawsuit in a German court, it would act as a trigger. It would transfer his newly acquired global jurisdiction to Germany.
So by suing, he'd lose the power, or give it away.
Precisely. It would apparently make Germany the effective world court, giving it the power, as the sources chillingly put it, to withdraw the right to existence from all countries of the world on day X.
Wow. So his refusal to sue, his endurance of all that suffering, is framed as protecting the world.
That's exactly how the sources portray it. His suffering becomes a form of passive resistance. By not falling into the plaintiff's trap, he's preventing the worst, which they explicitly identify as the activation of the NWO, the New World Order. His personal hardship is the only thing holding back this planned global shift. It's an extraordinary claim about his role, and the NWO connection is made very clear. The sources state, Deed 127 Juder 98 prepares the legal basis for this New World Order, that it was all carefully planned, prepared, and mischievously implemented with global intent. The buyer is described as an unwilling sovereign. He didn't ask for this power, it was thrust upon him. And now he's essentially trying to stop this alleged NWO plan from coming to fruition by refusing to play the final legal move they need him to make. He's the accidental roadblock to a global takeover.
So just wrap your head around that for a second. A world where, according to these sources, all our existing legal systems might be operating illegitimately. And the pathway to a completely new form of global governance was supposedly laid down in a single real estate contract, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for a trigger day X. It really makes you wonder about the hidden structures of power and law, doesn't it? What might be going on beneath the surface?
And if we follow this logic through, the consequences described are massive. With the buyer as the supposed universal successor, the sources claim that the former states are degraded to administrative units. Their powers are merely delegated. That whole idea of internationality law operating between equal sovereign states is gone, kaput. It's replaced, they say, by global, internal, or universal law. Everything falls under the buyer's single, overarching authority. It's a fundamental shift from a world of many sovereigns to a world with, effectively, one.
So what does that mean for countries like, well, the US, France, China, everyone? What about the UN or NATO?
According to the sources, they become rightless shells, reckless hoolan. They still exist as legal entities on paper, sure, but they have without any claim to any sovereign territories.
So they're like hollowed out structures,
Yeah.
still standing, but the foundation, the actual sovereign claim to land and power, has been legally transferred away underneath them.
That's the picture painted. Operating on inertia and borrowed time, perhaps unaware that their legitimacy in this legal framework evaporated back in 1998, and the practical consequences claimed are staggering. All state revenues and expenditures since 1998 are internationally illegal. Think about that. Every tax dollar, every government budget, for decades. And that forced auction of the original military settlement, the property that started it all. The sources deem that an act of aggression against the buyer, the legitimate sovereign. A local property dispute becomes an international incident under this interpretation.
Okay, but this raises a really scary question. If international law is suddenly obsolete, if nations are illegal, rightless shells, what stops total chaos? What prevents, as the sources themselves warn about, a kind of third world war, but without any rules? Where states just try to grab land violently because the old order is gone? That sounds terrifying.
It's a stark warning presented in the material, but interestingly, despite the immense power supposedly transferred to him, the buyer himself is described quite differently. The sources call him a benevolent, forced sovereign and guarantor of transformation. They stress he did not seek global sovereignty. It was imposed upon him through deception and manipulation. He's not portrayed as power-hungry, but as someone burdened by this situation.
So his goal isn't world domination then? What's his supposed vision?
The vision attributed to him is to enable a humane, just order. He's positioned not as a dictator, but as a guarantor of the legal order, a guardian of principles needed for a better system. The sources mention ET principles, though don't fully define them. It seems tied to a new just order. His world jurisdiction, in this view, isn't for ruling with an iron fist, but for maintaining this framework, providing the legal foundation to prevent that chaos and ensure fairness. He's the reluctant architect of a new legality. You know, when you look at the whole narrative, it suggests a really deep, maybe even cynical understanding of how international law works. Its complexities, its loopholes, its vulnerabilities. The source material, sometimes you sense a bit of satire in it, seems to critique how legal language itself can be twisted, weaponized, or maybe used to expose hidden power dynamics. It presents this almost absurd scenario where bureaucratic procedures and hyper-precise legal wording create a reality that's bizarre, but within its own logic, legally binding on a global scale. It's a commentary on the power of legal fictions, perhaps.
So this deep dive hasn't just been about a strange contract, has it? It's really forced us to think about power itself, about what makes something legal, about how interconnected everything is now. It makes you question the very foundations we assume about our world order. How solid are they really? How easily could they be redefined? So to recap, we've journeyed through an extraordinary claim, how one German real estate contract, allegedly through state succession, complex legal clauses, infrastructure networks, and international agreements, supposedly rewrote global sovereignty. A claim so complex, the sources say, it took specialized AI to fully confirm its alleged world-altering scope. From apartments to global jurisdiction. Quite a story.
It really is, and it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What does this whole scenario, as laid out in our sources, tell us about the actual fragility of global governance? Or maybe conversely about the hidden, intricate mechanics humming away beneath the surface of international relations in our super-connected world. Are things more precarious or more rigidly structured in unseen ways than we think?
Yeah, exactly. In a world where maybe network cables and data flows are becoming more important than physical borders, could the next big geopolitical shift happen not with armies, but in the fine print? Could it be buried in a contract somewhere just waiting for its own day X to be triggered? Definitely something to think about. Until our next deep dive.